topic is public health in the 80s and 90s with Eve Mokotoff and Jim Kent. Quick intros. Eve has dedicated over 3 decades to working in the field of HIV with a primary focus on utilizing HIV surveillance data for prevention and care. As a consultant, she's collaborated with more than 30 health departments on a range of topics and has also been actively involved in consulting for NASTAD. And then in addition, she served as the board chair for Unified from August 2019 to September 2021, and currently holds a position on Unified's board of directors. And whenever you're ready, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Mark. For those of you that know me, I wanted to let you know that these slides, I saved the old, for posterity's sake, the 2010 version of these slides that I presented at a CSTE meeting in Oregon. And as such, I have a script that I'm going to be using, which isn't my usual style, but bear with me. I think you'll find the content really helpful. So let me dive right in. I wanted to start by just to tell you I'm going to be giving you the political context of HIV and AIDS surveillance, because I think this is content that you're not likely to find elsewhere. I will talk about the development of the national surveillance system and then turn it over to Jim to talk about the technological rocket ship that got us where we are today. I just want to add, I started the statewide, it was then called the AIDS surveillance program from the Detroit Health Department in the beginning of 1986, because that's where most of the cases were. And Jim joined us in Lansing office and anchored that office in 1987, as Mark said in the introduction. So AIDS surveillance in the United States started when it was first described in June 1981 by physicians in Los Angeles and New York City, who began reporting previously healthy, severely immune-suppressed gay men appearing for care close to death. I use the term AIDS deliberately. We were collecting reports on people who met the developing AIDS case definition. The initial case definition was informal and included reported cases of Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis carinii pneumonia in young homosexual men, as seen in this first report 42 years ago, earlier this week, actually, June 5th, 1981. In 1982, more opportunistic illnesses, or OIs, were added. Up until September 1982, CDC officially referred to the syndrome with the neutral, if somewhat cumbersome term, Kaposi sarcoma and opportunistic infections in previously healthy persons. By this time, there were already Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, MMWR, articles describing similar symptoms among Haitians and persons with hemophilia A. In the September 24th, 1982 MMWR, they started using the term acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. However, elsewhere, the association between AIDS and homosexual men persisted, and the term gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID, was used in the more general scientific and lay press. Initially, case reports were taken verbally over the phone by the CDC. Richard Selleck, a recent retired CDC employee, took one of the first verbal reports from Michigan, and I show it to you here on this slide. In this picture of that case report, notice the name of the syndrome in December 1982, circled in green, was the Kaposi sarcoma opportunistic illnesses. In 1985, what became known as human immunodeficiency virus was identified as the causative agent of AIDS. Later that year, when the first HIV antibody tests were released and laboratories began to offer testing, it became possible to conduct surveillance for the virus itself. That wasn't possible before then. But the political environment and fear of this largely unknown and previously unknown and largely unexplored virus made for public health policy that was driven more by prejudice and fear than by sound public health principles that had been used to successfully combat previous communicable disease threats. This environment had a powerful impact on surveillance, and I believe impeded its natural evolution. It would be incomplete to discuss the history of surveillance for AIDS and HIV infection without a discussion of this political context. In the United States, the most vocal initial people presenting with this syndrome were white gay men. In the decade just prior to these first cases in 1981, the rise of the modern gay rights movement began. Its beginning is attributed to the June 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City 54 years ago. Wow. this month, where gay men and women finally fought back after decades of oppression and harassment. To quote Randy Shilts in his 1987 treatise, "And the Band Played On," future gay pride events commemorate, quote, "the riot in which Greenwich Village drag queens attacked police engaged in the routine harassment of a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn. From the Stonewall riot, the gay liberation movement was born, peopled by angry men and women." People often ask why this book, the classic history of the early days of HIV and AIDS, and which I recommend to all of you, is called "And the Band Played On." It represents the way the disease was ignored as long as it only affected those people, as in, while we were dying, the band played on and on. We are in a crisis and no one is listening to us. Shilts himself died of AIDS in 1994. This epidemic appeared on the heels of the active political gay liberation movement. The movement said you're not sick for having same-sex desires. Gay people were taking pride in who they were and expressing it through their sexuality. By 1973, even the American Psychological Association had said that homosexuality was not itself a disease. That may be a surprise to all of you, but in the 1970s, that was actually a big step. For gay men, this liberation movement meant no more shame about their desires, and for some it meant many, many partners. When this epidemic started, messages that were meant to protect them from what seemed to be a sexually transmitted infection, I say seemed to be because we were still figuring that out, felt like they were being pushed back into the closet of denial. It was impossible to do effective surveillance or prevention work in this country without understanding what it meant to gay men in the early 1980s to be told to stop having anonymous, unprotected sex. Someone once said to me, "But gay men had sky-high rates of syphilis and hepatitis B in the years leading up to this epidemic. What were they thinking?" My answer is they were thinking, "I am finally not a bad person." It was very much because this infection appeared just as these men were feeling comfortable and confident as themselves that it was able to infiltrate itself into the population. Of course, they should have recognized that high rates of syphilis and Hep B were not a good thing, but this just isn't how people think or act. Albeit gay, as white men, they were used to having access to decision makers in their communities. They were not satisfied with the little attention being given to something that was decimating their community. When their peers started dying from a new disease, there was anger about the lack of action taken to combat it. However, the political leadership of the United States was silent about this explosion of deaths among young men in the prime of their lives. This was in contrast to the publicity and political discourse that followed the initial outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease in 1976 at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia and toxic shock syndrome in 1980. Legionnaire's disease was named after the people who experienced the first outbreak, members of the American Legion, an organization of veterans of the United States Armed Forces who served in wartime. Toxic shock syndrome struck menstruating women. You can't get more mainstream than veterans and women of childbearing age. As soon as the first outbreaks were detected, our health infrastructure mobilized and tackled the problem. HIV, on the other hand, affected members of society that some thought deserved what they got. However, the white gay community expected and wanted the same kind of discussion and action that was taken with Legionnaire's and toxic shock syndrome when this syndrome appeared. They were to be disappointed. Indeed, the President of the United States at the time, Ronald Reagan, did not even mention the illness until 27,000 Americans were dead or dying from it. In early 1987, 6 years after the first cases were described, the U.S. was the only industrialized nation that had not launched a coordinated education campaign. 6 years into the epidemic, the president finally uttered the word AIDS, but had still not given an address on the topic. The president had not even met with his Surgeon General to discuss the epidemic. I clearly recall listening to a radio report of the president discussing aid to the Nicaraguan Contra rebels. He slipped and said the word AIDS, corrected himself, chuckled, and went on with his discussion of Nicaragua. The silence was thundering. Finally, on May 31st, 1987, 6 years after the first reports, President Reagan gave his first address on AIDS. At that time, 36,058 Americans had been diagnosed with AIDS and 20,849 had died. These data are from Shilts' book. But how did we know that? We know that because of the work that we all do. The white gays community relationship to AIDS surveillance was paradoxical. They did not trust the government since it had shown little practice of protecting their rights in the past. However, they knew that in order to argue their needs, they needed the numbers that surveillance could give them to show the severity of the epidemic. In New York City in the late 1980s, Dr. Alan Greenberg was working on setting up a surveillance project among outpatients with HIV and AIDS. Once, when asked by a frustrated member of the community if public health officials realized how bad the AIDS epidemic really was, he responded, "Exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's why we do surveillance." The need for the numbers won out, and most people with AIDS were so sick that they were not working and died soon after diagnosis. These next two slides will give you a feel for what this was like. Given the severe level of illness, it was felt that the risk of violation of confidentiality was outweighed by public health's need to obtain the case reports, and by and large, the white gay community did not fight name-based AIDS reporting. Rather rapidly, AIDS became a notifiable disease using a name-based reporting system in all 50 states. The acceptance of AIDS surveillance was assisted by the fact that after the initial period of reporting that was done by calling CDC directly, that was through 1982, patient names were not, and as most of you probably know, are not now sent to CDC. Politically, reporting of HIV infection was another matter entirely. Now public health, the government, wanted the names, mode of transmission, and other personal information on people who may not even appear ill. They were still working and had active lives. Many believed that they had more to lose if it became known that they were HIV infected than did their sicker peers who had had AIDS. Despite the availability of drugs to treat the major opportunistic illnesses prior to the highly active antiretroviral or treatment or HAART era in 1996, when deaths plummeted, there appeared to be little benefit to getting tested. Consequently, measuring the leading edge of the epidemic in the late 1980s and early 1990s relied on anonymous seroprevalence surveys conducted in public health clinics that treated people with STDs, TB, or that provided family planning services. We did those surveys in Detroit, and our own wonderful Vivian Griffin was deeply involved in that work, as were other people that are still part of the Bureau. Without an incentive to get tested for HIV before the appearance of AIDS-related clinical symptoms, HIV reporting was not a priority in the 1980s. By the 1990s, more effective treatments were developed and improved. The push for HIV reporting increased. It would be inaccurate, however, to portray the epidemic in the mid-1980s as occurring entirely in white gay men. But before going on to who else was affected, I'm showing this slide to give you more of a feel for what it was like back then. The photo credits are in the slides, but briefly, the two on the left are photos from the first AIDS Hospice Center. An article called "The First AIDS Hospice Center Tells a Story of Struggle and Resistance." I thought some of these pictures were just incredibly beautiful and haunting. Although white gay men made themselves the most visible, the risk of infection was as high or higher for less noticeable men who had sex with men, many of whom did not identify as gay, were from a broad spectrum of race and socioeconomic groups, and had even more to risk if publicly identified as HIV positive. In the early days of this epidemic, gay was code for white, and IVDU, intravenous drug user was the term used in the 80s, was code for Black or Hispanic. There was very little discussion or recognition of the risk for Black MSM, and I personally believe that it was the virtual ignoring of infection among MSM of color that has brought us to the current decade where Black people make up 14% of the US population, but represent 42% of new HIV diagnoses. But in the 1980s, in addition to MSM and people who inject drugs, hemophiliacs who received factor VIII or IX blood clotting treatments were also notably affected by HIV. Some estimates suggested that before heat treatment of the clotting factor used to treat them, 90+% of severe hemophiliacs were HIV infected. The most legendary of these was, of course, Ryan White, who died 33 years ago. His picture, I don't think you can see my cursor here. Anyway, is the top two pictures with the young boy at the top of the slide. I want to talk about him briefly in case some of you only associate his name with the program that supports our HIV care program. He and his family lived in Kokomo, Indiana, where he was diagnosed with AIDS in December 1984 at the age of 13. He was then expelled from middle school. As a result, he and his mother, Jean White Ginder, fought for his right to attend school, gaining international attention as a voice of reason about HIV and AIDS. I'm going to ignore chat for now so I can keep going. We can look at those later, or I'll get interrupted by Mark if there's something I need to stop and pay attention to. I took multiple court hearings with testimony from medical experts for him to be able to attend school. However, his mother reports it was really bad. People were really cruel. People said he had to be gay or that he'd have done something bad or wrong, or he wouldn't have had it. It was God's punishment. We heard the God's punishment a lot, that somehow, some way he had done something he shouldn't have done or he wouldn't have gotten AIDS. He died on April 8th, 1990 at the age of 18, just months before Congress passed the AIDS bill. Passed the AIDS bill that bears his name. It was originally called the Ryan-White Care Act. It stood for Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency. The legislation's been reauthorized. All those hearts are making it worse, you guys. Thank you. Oh, God, I thought I wouldn't do this, but anyway, it never gets old, unfortunately. I wish it would. Phew. The legislation's been reauthorized at least 4 times in 1996, 2000, 2006, and 2009, and is now called the Ryan-White HIV/AIDS program. Another hemophilia-related account of discrimination that gives you a flavor of what it was like in the 1980s was the Ray family of Arcadia, Florida. In August 1987, a suspicious fire destroyed their home. The family included 3 young brothers with HIV, and the blaze capped a week of bomb threat and death threats and a school boycott resulting from the brothers' return to classes at the start of the school year. The Ray brothers have been a focus of national attention because of their parents' legal efforts to have them reinstated in school. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the other people pictured on this slide, but you can read about them in the notes. Before turning to the development of our surveillance system, here's a small example of early forms of stigma and fear from 1987. I actually cut that out myself, probably from the Ann Arbor News back in the 1980s. Turning now to the development of a comprehensive surveillance system in the United States. The next 8 slides show the progression of implementing named HIV reporting throughout the United States. The reason for the rapid implementation in 2006 is related directly to requirements for the 2006 reauthorization of the Ryan-White Care Act, and I'll talk about that in a second. In 1995, Michigan had started this is 1995. I'll give you a second just to look over the legend that you're going to see in each of the next slides. Michigan started getting named HIV reports in 1990. It wasn't that straightforward, but time does not allow Jim or I to get into all those details. We were never a code-based reporting state, and these codes were based on different things in different states, but usually it was some combination of part of the first and last name, date of birth, etc. This slide is 5 years later in 2000. You can see a lot of progress since 95, and some of this was due to HAART, the highly active antiretroviral therapy, and it gave people a reason to find out they were HIV positive since HAART was extending lives. However, notice that almost 20 years after the first AIDS cases were identified and reported, we still didn't have named or code reporting in California and New York, which together accounted for about 1/3 of the nation's HIV morbidity. California was second only to New York in number of cases reported, and alone accounted for about 14% of all cases in the country, while New York accounted for about 18% at that time. This is January 2002. You can see we're making some progress. Here at the end of 2002, we see that California had implemented code-based HIV reporting. Georgia, embarrassingly, I have to say, for CDC, had not yet implemented any form of HIV reporting. In January 2004, everyone is on board some way or another. Note that this is 23 years after the first report of the illness. In this slide from January 2006 and the next, which will show you December 2006, you will see that 2006 was a pivotal year for the change to name-based HIV reporting. CDC sent out a letter that year recommending named reporting. In addition, the belief that it was inevitable that the Ryan-White Care Act reauthorization would result in counting HIV cases for the formula itself, the formula for funding, allowed many states to overcome the political opposition to name-based HIV reporting. California introduced legislation to start the conversion to name reporting in this critically important state. CDC did not accept data from non-name reporting states, and so without California, we still did not, 25 years after the first AIDS case, have a national HIV reporting system. Here is the end of 2006. And finally, in April 2008, here we have everybody with name-based reporting for HIV. But CDC did not include states' HIV data in most parts of the National Surveillance Report for statistical adjustment reasons until they have what was considered a mature system deemed to take 4 years. So it was 2013, 32 years after the first AIDS case reports, that we had a truly national HIV statistical report. I was talking to a medical historian who was working on this, and he's like, I saw these national reports. I said, yeah, you should look at the footnotes and you'll see what states were involved. So there were earlier reports. They just didn't include, California. To wrap up and jumpstart Jim's discussion of the technological changes, I have to show you this picture of something I found when digging through my historical value slides, pieces of paper. And it's something I clearly put together when I started the program in early 1986 to think about where to focus my efforts. It lists the major Michigan hospitals in the first column and the years across the top. I think many of you will appreciate the whiteout in the graph paper. I found it kind of fascinating. Remember that back then, or maybe you don't know this, but everyone was hospitalized, so you could focus surveillance on the hospitals and not the laboratories and all the outpatient settings that became the norm in 1986 once we had effective treatments. This was 10 years before that. I want to close with one of my favorite slides, courtesy of Ken Castro from CDC, and thank all of you who do this work in Michigan and around the country, for those of you that do work at other places. I continue to learn about surveillance from those of you working at health departments, and thank you for caring about the quality of the data that we collect. Doing our best to get the data analyzed and back out there is to be used to stop the epidemic. Never forget that is why we collect it. Thank you. And I'll turn this over to Jim now. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Eve.